Welcome to the Robotics Through Science Fiction podcast. Today's podcast is about sex and robots and sex and love and robots. And I have here Dr. Aimee van Wynsberghe, a professor at the Technical University of Delft and a director of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. Aimee, thanks for joining us, and tell us about yourself, your background in robotics, and the Foundation for Responsible Robotics.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be a part of your podcast. A little bit about me. I come from a background in cell biology, of course, as one would expect. And I studied cell biology in Canada. I did my undergraduate degree there. And while I was doing my studies, at the same time, I was a research assistant at a very new institute in Canada called CSTAR, which stands for Canadian Surgical Technologies and Advanced Robotics. And I was part of a team that was, one of the world's first looking at how we could train surgeons on surgical robotics, the Da Vinci surgical system and the Zeus surgical system, the telesurgical system, and also looking at what happened to surgeon performance when we would introduce different variables like a delay in the signal transmission or jitter between the signal from the surgeon hands to the robotic arms inserted into the patient. And it was during this time actually that I really started to think about how the patient felt, when the doctor said that there was a big robot that was going to be introduced into the surgical suite, or how the surgeon felt now that they were really detached from the patient in a certain way, not, literally standing over with their hands inside the patients, but now sitting at a different side of the room or in a different hospital or in a different country. And that led me to ask the more ethical and societal questions related to robotics. So I left cell biology and I moved to Europe and I began to study applied ethics and bioethics, and I've really been trying to do ethical analyses and reflections on various kinds of robots, starting with healthcare and then moving into the more service robot industry. But through the whole course of my career, the focus has really been how can we bring ethics into the design space? So how can we use ethics as a kind of tool to actually open up new ways of design and new ways of innovation when it comes to robotics?
Wow, that is amazing. I didn't realize that you had started out in cell biology, but it makes such great sense with that human-centered design. Now, what makes the Foundation different from, the gazillion groups that are constantly twittering about, weaponized drones are bad, robots are bad? What does the Foundation do?
Yeah, so I should begin also by telling you a little bit about the Foundation. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we're established here in the Netherlands, where I live and work. We have an office in The Hague, and we're fairly new. We're only about 2 years old, so we haven't been around for very long, but we're really trying to, and are gaining traction and trying to pave a way forward. We are predominantly a group of academics, but we work very closely with NGOs, with industry, and with policymakers. And we have a mission, which is to shape a future of robotics that's done responsibly, right? So how can we envision what responsible design, development, regulation, and use means, what it looks like, and then how can we take the steps to actually put this into action? We have 3 different ways that we try and realize our mission. We hold workshops where we try and bring all of the different stakeholders together. It's really important, if you're a company working on developing a wearable robotics system and at the same table you have an academic who's studying the meaning of touch, it's really important to bring these 2 together to try and learn from one another. We also do consultation documents, and the incentive behind doing this is really to raise awareness about different robotics innovations and initiatives, as well as educating the public and policymakers about what's going on, and perhaps we should be taking a stance. And our 3rd area of focus is public-private partnerships. So how can we actually join forces with industry to shape the future development of robotics? So what makes us different, you might be guessing here already, is that we're not talking about weaponized robotics. We're not talking about autonomous killing robots. It is true that one of the co-directors is very vocal in that arena, but the Foundation for Responsible Robotics is really trying to separate themselves from this smaller application area, not to minimize the significance and the importance of asking these questions, but really at the same time, there's an incredible number of applications that we have to address. There's an incredible number of ethical issues that we need to look at. We also study robots in humanitarian applications. So what does it mean to use a drone to create maps or to collect data on vulnerable demographics who can't speak up for themselves, who certainly can't give informed consent, and so on and so forth, but balancing that at the same time with the idea that these drones can provide access to people that we can't geographically, reach, we can't physically get there, or it allows us to see areas that, again, we couldn't get to if we didn't have the drone. So it's about trying to balance the pros and cons of technology and having this discussion on a large scale. Humanitarian drones, but we're also focusing on environmental applications of robotics, robots for protection of endangered species, or even just monitoring the environment. There's an incredible number of applications and issues that are so deserving of attention that go beyond the militarized use and ideas of robotics.
Well, let's get to sex and robots, because that's an area, we're hearing a lot about, of course, weaponized drones, but sex and robots is showing up a lot in the media. In the United States, we've got the HBO series Westworld is starting its new season, and it has lots of robot sex and rape. And also we've had another Canadian, Annalise Newell's book, Autonomous, has been nominated for a Nebula Award. And it has a robot-human relationship, even though that robot isn't built for sex. And the Foundation did that interesting study, Our Sexual Future with Robots. What prompted that? And was that due to science fiction ideas, or are there real sex bots out there?
Yeah. So I think you could say it was a combination of the two, right? With the emergence of Westworld and another show called Humans, this idea of having sex with these objects is being presented as more of a realistic option. So you have, definitely it's appearing in science fiction, but also in the real world. You have about 4 companies right now in the United States alone that are developing sex robots. And this is, building off of the precursors to sex robots. So we have sex dolls that are really a lot more prevalent than you would imagine. And we have teledildonics, which is the introduction of a telecommunication network into sexual practices, not with a full embodied tool, but with a smaller tool that represents just sort of a certain body part. But you have, the development of AI, you have sex dolls, you have teledildonics, you have all of these different disciplines that are developing in tandem, and it's really only a matter of time before they all come together and we have, the idealistic sex robot. So we see companies already doing it. They range in price between, $5,000 and $50,000, depending on whether or not you want specific preferences and how difficult those are to actually make in the robots. And really, the report was about presenting an impartial, a very neutral perspective on this developing technology. So not to say this is good or bad, but really to just show the public and to show policymakers this is what's happening right now, and we should have a discussion about where we want sex to go in the future, how we want to envision these robots into society, if we want to envision them in society at all. So in the report, we were exploring
here, but what about regulations? I mean, you just said something very interesting to me. You're saying, we're trying to talk to policymakers about that. Why are we talking to policymakers about sex and sex dolls?
Yeah. So this has to do with, and of course, I recognize the fact that the idea of creating regulations is something that is sort of scoffed at the moment, because we've seen that regulations aren't capable of keeping up with the pace of technology. So whether or not this is possible is one part of the debate, or one question, and then how we would do it is another part of the debate. When we consider why we would have regulations and what those would look like, this means that we have to get into some of the more darker sides of sex dolls and sex robots. So one of the, I mentioned whether or not you wanted specific characteristics of the sex dolls. You can have these dolls or these robots that look, that appear in childlike form. Right, so we have to, exactly. We have to, as a society, decide, is this the kind of technology that we want readily available to individuals? Now, on the one hand, there are some individuals that say, well, this could be a benefit, right? We could be protecting children from pedophiles who want to have sex or to harm or to take advantage of children in some way. Okay, so off the bat, right, I would say my intuition says, yeah, essentially that sounds like a good idea. But what is the study that we're going to do to prove that hypothesis? Right? You need to have a control group. You need to have an experimental group. How are you really going to get statistically significant data that shows that, yes, in fact, these are a benefit to children? They have the end result or the end consequence of protecting them. Rather than, there's also another group of people who say the idea that individuals with these inclinations or these desires, if they get to reinforce them, or act on them, this could normalize it, make it easier, make it more desirable to go further and further, right? So it might not satiate their desires in the end. So you have these.
I've gotten such good practice. Let me do it with a real child.
Exactly. And it could also be used as a a training tool. You invite children in and say that this is how you do it. Look at what I do with my robot. Let's try it with you. So, we could be getting into some really scary, ethically, morally problematic areas. And testing them is also morally problematic. And so this may be one area where we just say, look, it's wrong. We don't want to normalize it. Therefore, we're banning it. We're creating a regulation that does not allow the design, the shipment, or the development of this particular sex robot or sex doll.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but when I think about it, it makes perfect sense about regulations and to start thinking about those. I know that you're doing it. Are there any countries or governments that are particularly proactive when it comes to thinking about robots and unmanned systems in general, and maybe even for Sexbots?
Right. Well, the UK is actually leading when it comes to the childlike representations of the sex dolls, and they have brought charges against a couple of individuals who are now in jail for the shipment of these childlike versions. Again, Canada has one case going on, but still sort of undecided in how the outcome will be. Really, we see that Asia is doing a lot in terms of the development, the production, the buying, the selling. Germany is also doing quite a bit in terms of just the bringing the technology into this world, but no country is really creating a plan to path a future of responsible development, creating strategies for mitigating the potential negative consequences that will actually come in the end. I would say Europe, just yesterday, 25 European countries decided to sign an agreement where they would work together in terms of combating the societal issues associated with artificial intelligence. And so, of course, AI is a part of robotics, and we could say that is a great step forward, but much more needs to be done. We need to have global thinking on these issues. We need to have plans in place that go beyond the GDPR in terms of data protection and privacy, especially when it comes to sex robots. The kind of data that can be collected, this intimate data, and the fact that you'll have generations of data accumulated between individuals and their robots, we have to start thinking of new ways, because we have new, sensitive, and different kinds of intimate data being collected. So I would say right now, not enough is being done, but that's not all doom and gloom. We still have the opportunity to do things, and that's where the Foundation for Responsible Robotics is trying to come into. To encourage and to try and find ways to facilitate different forms of regulation.
Well, that is so important, and that's why I'm so glad to have you on the podcast to expose our audience to these really important technology policy decisions that I'm pretty sure we're not looking at in the United States. So let's wrap up. Finally, what's your favorite science fiction book or movie with robot love or sex in it?
I'm actually a huge fan of Westworld, I have to say. I love the very idea that Westworld has kind of brought us into confrontation with our human inclinations and human behavior. It's almost holding up a mirror to ourselves and saying, look at what you might do if you thought that there was no consequences to your action. So that I find to be the most shocking part of the series in general. But I must say, I'm also, not necessarily related to sex robots per se, but I'm a huge fan of Isaac Asimov's story called Feminine Intuition, where it's, this question of how females in particular can reason in a certain way. And so they want to create a robot that has that unique capability to reason in this way. It's, it seems fascinating, especially because all the sex robots that we see out there are represented as females. So it's really interesting to think about this link between feminine intuition and how we want to now program that into something. And it's questionable.
Absolutely. Well, Aimee, thank you so much for making time to be with us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.